Hey, good morning. I'm Chicken Johnny, and you're down in the grow room with Chicken Johnny. And I just thought I'd talk to you for a few minutes about genetically modified organisms. Now, one of the things about GMOs is that, well, it's complicated. It's not as simple as some people might want to present it on the internet. And there's a lot of political pressure involved in genetically modified science. So we're going to take a 10,000 mile view. I mean, a low definition view at what genetically modified organisms are. If after watching this program you'd like to see more of it, just hit that thumbs up button, make a comment in the comments section. Certainly subscribe and follow the channel, but let me know that you'd like me to delve deeper. As I prepared for this subject, I was not really prepared for what I was going to find out. There's a lot to this. It's complicated. So let's get to it. So, what is a GMO? What do we really need to understand about genetically modified organisms? How do they differ from other types of farming? That's one argument you'll often hear, is that genetically modifying food is something that is, it's brand new. And actually, it really started in about 1995 if we're talking about laboratory genetic engineering. But if we're talking about engineering plants, it goes back over 3,000 years. In fact, the first grafted plants were in Egypt. Well, at least the first ones that we know about were in Egypt, and they were grafting orchids. Well, we've had thousands and thousands of plants that have been created through breeding. In fact, none of the plants we presently grow look anything like they would have looked, say, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. So, what makes GMO technology different from line breeding and grafting and all of those things? Well, not as much as you might think. The fact is that what a scientist does when he creates a genetically modified organism is he goes into the DNA of the plant. Now, the DNA is the recipe. It's the recipe for the plant. You might say that it's the blueprint for the plant. But if you think of it as a recipe, we take the plant, we look at the recipe, and because there was an intelligent designer that designed that DNA, that recipe, we can go in and we can look at the various different proteins in the DNA chain, and we can figure out what each one of those proteins does in the plant. So each of those proteins is responsible for ensuring that something is happening in the plant or in a human body or in an animal, because all living creatures share the idea of DNA. So what a scientist does is he isolates the protein in that DNA chain that is responsible for a certain characteristic. For example, I have blue eyes, and you could find that DNA protein or group of proteins that is responsible for eye color. And if you wanted to modify that, theoretically anyway, you could. Now, that's one of the problems that people have with DNA, is that we're playing God. But okay, getting back to what DNA is, DNA is simply a process of going in and eliminating that protein that's responsible for that characteristic, or inserting a protein that's responsible for a different characteristic. I'm not going to get into how they do that because it involves guns and bacteria and viruses and all kinds of scary stuff, but it really isn't all that scary if you understand how it works. for our conversation, we just need to understand that we're manipulating proteins within the DNA, which is the genetic chain. Whereas in line breeding, what we're doing is we're altering the proteins in the DNA chain, but we don't specifically know which proteins we're altering. We're just breeding two plants together. In the case of a plant, we'd be cross-pollinating two plants and hoping that the progeny of that parent plants will result in a plant that has shared characteristics of the two parents. And so it takes dozens and maybe hundreds of years to move from one thing to another to improve that plant significantly. People have spent their entire lives perfecting a fruit or a vegetable. That's why we name some of these vegetables after the people who produced them, or perhaps after their town or after their company. Whereas when we genetically modify an organism, we identify it by its genetic modification. So, for example, Roundup Ready corn, or BT eggplant, or golden rice. We're naming the golden rice for the characteristic that we bred field corn DNA into, or put field corn DNA into that rice to enhance the vitamin A in golden rice. So a genetically modified organism differs from grafting and from line breeding in that it's precise, it's precision. We do it one time, and then we test the progeny of that experiment. We test the offspring of the parent plants down several generations. And so what would take 50, 60 years, we can do in 5 or 6. Now, when we line breed a plant, there's no testing done in terms of whether that plant is healthy for the environment or whether that plant is healthy for human consumption. And we have found various different times that plants that have been bred for certain characteristics have become invasive in certain settings. So, if genetically modified organisms are as simple as just changing the DNA chain, and that's really the same thing that we've been doing with line breeding, why is there so much controversy? As I've researched this topic in order to make this video, I've found 3, really 4 different categories arguing against GMOs. 4 categories of negative consequences of GMOs, or at least the fear of negative consequences of GMOs. First, there's the ethical question of GMOs. Is it an ethical thing to modify God's creation? Or is it ethical to endanger potentially future environmental issues or endanger future generations in order to create a genetically modified food organism today? The second argument is the environmental argument, which sort of comes out of that first argument. The argument that by creating genetically modified organisms, we put the earth at risk. We run the risk of creating an organism that will do more damage than good. The third is a question of whether it's healthy or not to eat genetically modified organisms. Will consuming a genetically modified food create a health problem for you, or maybe for your children, or maybe for your grandchildren? In other words, what are the long-term health effects of consuming genetically modified foods? And then if there's a fourth argument, but I don't really think this is an argument. I think that this is the motivation behind the whole GMO dispute, and that's money, or politics, or power, control, influence. Well, then there are four categories in favor of genetic modification or genetic engineering. One is an ethical argument, and the argument goes something like this. There are people in Bangladesh who are so impoverished that they can't afford food, and the land that they live on is so poor, the soil is so underdeveloped that they can't grow a crop on it. So by developing genetically modified organisms to grow in areas where they wouldn't otherwise grow, we create a pathway for them to feed themselves. Now, the second reason why people are pro-GMO is because of the benefits it has to the ecology. Let me give you some examples. By using BT-ready corn, which is not available on the market yet as far as I know, but by using BT-ready corn, we can cut down on the number of pesticides that are sprayed on the fields. Now, other crops have BT, and the ground has BT in it, so we're not adding something new, but we're cutting down on the amount of pesticide that gets sprayed onto a field. And because the BT isn't sprayed on the field, we aren't endangering the beneficials, because the beneficials don't chew the corn, they don't chew our cabbage and so forth. So if something is BT available within the plant, you're not spraying insecticides. And the final argument is that we're not using nearly as much diesel fuel to cultivate our fields, because we're able to apply no-till principles where we otherwise perhaps couldn't. And the third argument, food health, is the argument that genetically modified foods can actually be made more healthy. We can eliminate trans fats that cause cancer, things that... So you see that really the arguments for and the arguments against are really the same arguments. They're just coming from two different sides of the coin. So let's delve deeper into the first argument, the ethical question. Should we modify food genetically? You know, when I think about the ethical question about GMOs, should we? Well, I think of Jeff Goldblum in the movie Jurassic Park. I can't remember the name of his character, but he looked at the other people, the marketing people and the curator of Jurassic Park, and he said, you know, the problem with this is your scientists were so preoccupied with the question of whether they could that they never asked whether they should. And so I think it's important that we examine the ethical side of genetically modified organisms. Now, this is an area where I actually think this is kind of simple. There are places in this world where people don't get enough nutrition. And one of the areas of nutrition that's greatly lacking is vitamin A. There are places where rice grows pretty easily, and it's available to even the poorest people among us. But rice has no vitamin A. So the question is, if we can add vitamin A to rice by making a simple genetic modification, and we properly test that plant to make sure that there won't be any obvious unsuspecting consequences like that. If we test it and we run it through trials and we find that it's safe, is it ethical to modify food, to modify a plant so that it's healthier for people to eat? And I guess the question that comes to my mind, and this is why it's relatively simple for me, is it ethical for us not to modify a food to make it more nutritious? You know, we get vitamin A in our food, and there are places in this world where they don't. Is it ethical for us to say, well, so they go blind? At least we haven't damaged the environment for our grandchildren, 150 years down the road. And we'll deal with that environmental question in a second, but let's stick with the ethics for just a moment. I believe in an intelligent designer, a creator. And so if there's a better plant out there, why didn't he create it? I mean, that's really kind of the question that you might want to ask somebody like me. If golden rice is so great, if BT eggplant is so spectacular, if potatoes, BT ready potatoes are so wonderful, why didn't God just create them? Well, I wonder maybe if he did. You see, the Bible teaches us that after God created man in the Garden of Eden, Eden was a spectacular place. And God said that man should rule over the plants and the animals of the garden, and that everything there, all of the green plants, were there for man to eat. And he said it this way. He said, you should have dominion over those plants. But there's one plant, a tree, actually two, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. And God said, you shall not partake of those plants. Well, you know the story. Even if you're not a religious person, you know that Eve and then Adam both violated God's command and they partook of the fruit. Now, the punishment for that, this is where we're getting to genetically modified organisms. The punishment for that is God said, from this time forward, now you will produce your fruit produce your food from the sweat of your brow. In other words, he cursed the ground and the plants that grew out of it, and into the garden came weeds and insects and viruses and all kinds of things that weren't originally present in the garden. So my point is that perhaps God had created all of the foods that we're striving to create. Botanists talk about that the fruits and vegetables we're eating today have no real relationship, visually or nutritionally or to taste. They have no relationship to what was, say, 4,000 years ago. Peaches, for example, we've got smaller peach pits than we used to, and more of the meaty fruit material that we eat. And, I'm not going to give you a bunch of examples of that. You know what they are. Bananas were full of seeds until a few hundred years ago. So, if I'm correct in saying that in the Garden of Eden things were perfect and things have fallen into, now let's say, disrepair because of man's sin, then maybe God is allowing us to modify genetically, removing the proteins that he put in after the fall of man. Like I said, it's complicated. But if your ethical stand is that we shouldn't modify food because if God wanted it that way, he would have created it that way. Well, if God wanted us to drive cars, rubber tires would grow on trees. If God wanted us to build houses, well, he'd have built them for us. That argument that if God wanted it this way, he would have made it that way, for the most part, it doesn't hold water in any argument. But it certainly doesn't hold it in this. So the question, is it ethical to modify genetically a food product so that some nation of children doesn't have to go blind? Of course. So I think the ethical question is really answered. We have a responsibility to our fellow man, each one of us, to do what we can to make their lives better. Now, the Shed Wars collaboration that I'm a part of states as its aim that we're going to teach the world to grow again. And I think it's a noble purpose. And I think worldwide there are a lot of groups that would like to help countries where food is less available to grow more food. Remember, the issue of starvation has really nothing to do with how much food the world produces, but it's a logistics issue. Can we get the food where it needs to go? Can the people who need the food afford the food? Now, if we took all of our table scraps and put them into containers and sent them off to Bangladesh, maybe the people of Bangladesh would have some rotten food to compost and make their ground better, but it really wouldn't help them. The people of Bangladesh need to be able to grow food for themselves in their own location. I'm not saying that GMOs will solve that problem. I'm just saying that they're a tool. GMOs are a tool in our toolbox. Well, let's move on. What about the environmental issue? So generally, the environmental argument goes something like this. Genetically modified organisms like Roundup Ready corn and Roundup Ready soybeans, Roundup Ready cotton. These Roundup Ready products encourage the overuse of herbicides. And herbicides Roundup is now becoming less effective because we're growing super-powered weeds that Roundup can't kill. All right, I don't mean to show my bias there, but arguing that genetically modified food should be eliminated entirely because Roundup encourages the use of pesticides, it's just a bad argument. Because what's that got to do with BT eggplant? What's that got to do with golden rice? What's that got to do with genetically modified apples and genetically modified potatoes or mangoes? So we need to take the arguments one at a time. Maybe there is an environmental impact to the use of Roundup, specifically glyphosate, on farm crops. It really isn't that they're creating super weeds, and in a couple of weeks maybe I'll do a video about how weed resistance is created. But at this point, I just want to leave it here. You can't argue against genetically modified organisms because of the abuse of glyphosate, especially when BT-ready crops are going to make insecticides a thing of the past, maybe. Maybe. So my point is that the environmental impacts have to be looked at on an individual basis, just like we might look at the environmental impacts of bringing a new vegetable or a new crop into our own garden, or bringing something from overseas into the U.S. We need to look at the idea of whether each individual genetically modified organism will pose a threat. The other side of the argument is that we've tested for environmental impact. The EPA, the FDA, the WHO, along with the USDA, they've all looked at the environmental impacts. Now, none of these folks are fallible, and we've had our share of problems that have come from not taking the time to really sort through whether something is safe to bring to this country. We now have things like Asian beetles that are creating all kinds of havoc within the U.S. We have things like carp in some of our lakes, and this carp is uncontrollable and it's causing problems. Hopefully, we're testing well enough that we don't make those mistakes again. But I think it's wrong to argue that all GMOs should be eliminated because of the environmental impact brought on by glyphosate. So then we come to the third and almost final argument. One of the questions that has to be answered is, are GMO foods safe for the consumer? Are they edible? Will they cause problems? Now, in my research, I came up with two areas of health concern that really piqued my curiosity and made me a little bit concerned about the safety of GMOs. The first one is, because GMOs are genetically modified, and because cancer is a disease that is a modification of genes, how do genetically modified foods, how do they react with cancer? Well, genetically modified foods are genetically stable. In other words, they're not going to attack our genes. They're not going to affect your genes or my genes or our genetics. Genetically modified foods are, for all intensive purposes, identical to the non-genetic foods, only they have traits that the genes have brought into that fruit, whether it be that it won't bruise as easily, like in the case of some of the potatoes, or whether it won't have virus spots on the outside of it, like the case of mangoes. Well, the reality is that it has no impact whatsoever on cancer. And that's something that people talk about a lot. There is no link, or at least no known link, between genetically modified foods and cancer. The other one, and this is kind of something of concern, allergies, foodborne allergies. Now, why is that a concern? Well, there was some experiments where they were using genes, genetic proteins, from a Brazil nut to bring a particular quality to another plant. And what they found out was that that would make, not only would they bring that positive quality across, but that positive quality somehow linked to the allergy to Brazil nuts. So if you had an allergy to Brazil nuts, you'd now have an allergy to the new plant. And so scientists stopped researching that particular GMO. What I found from my research was, if you have an allergy to peanuts, you're going to have an allergy to genetically modified peanuts if we were to come up with them, unless they were specifically manipulated to eliminate whatever causes the allergy. Now, food allergies are allergies to food, and when we take genetic information from one plant and put it into another, we may bring that food allergy with it, and so we have to test for that. And scientists are able to test for those foodborne allergies. So there is not any evidence whatsoever, and none of the people who are saying that GMOs aren't healthy, none of those people can bring anything but their opinion. They don't have any repeatable evidence, anything that they can show that demonstrates that GMOs aren't healthy. There's a lot of fear about the health of GMOs, and I understand why, but they don't hold up. They don't hold up to the test. And on the other side of that coin, you've got people who are saying, okay, well, GMOs can increase vitamin A. So if they can increase vitamin A, maybe they can also make some other changes. Maybe they can also modify food in other ways that benefit us. And so researching genetically modified organisms is an important thing. Doing that research may come up with a lot of answers. Now, I have a particular horse in this race. I have diabetes, and my diabetes isn't genetic. It's self-afflicted. I practiced very poor diet practices all my life. I've got a killer sweet tooth, and even though I'm fighting blood sugar, I'm constantly failing to keep to my diet. So I take several medications, and one of the things that I take is Lantus insulin. Lantus insulin is genetically modified to be effective at eliminating sugar in my system. If it weren't for Lantus, my medications would be unaffordable, and because I'm a type 2 diabetic, I probably wouldn't even have a practical access to insulin, because type 2 diabetes need basal insulin, not fast-acting insulin, and so therefore I'd be in a much more difficult position than I am now. And I'm hoping that over time genetic research can perhaps even find the genes that affect the human body, causing us to be diabetic. And that brings me to what I will end on, and that is the almighty dollar. People who are against GMO and GE products have argued that Monsanto's, who is the originator of genetically modified corn, Roundup Ready corn, and Monsanto's also been involved in a lot of the other projects to institute genetically modified food into our food system. The argument is that Monsanto's is making millions, in fact probably billions of dollars, off of genetically modified food, genetically modified organisms. And my question is, who cares? Well, then the argument comes back, yes, but Monsanto is taking control of our food supply. Well, only if we let them. Because here's the thing. In the United States, we don't have to use Roundup Ready corn. 90% of the corn we grow is Roundup Ready. But we don't have to. Well, they point to the patents that Monsanto's has put on their seeds. They say, well, it's unethical that Monsanto would create Roundup Ready corn and then you can't save seeds and replant that corn. Well, that's just not true. Roundup Ready corn is a stabilized corn, and you will be able to save the seeds and replant them and grow new corn. But it's not legal. Farmers have to certify by contract that they won't save seeds. They won't save them to replant next year. They won't save them to share with their neighbors. And if you stop and think about it, it makes sense. And this is the case with a lot of other products that come to market as well. My neighbors, they're about 4 miles away, so they're not really neighbors, but one of the gardens here in Harvard created a type of corn called Murray corn. Murray corn is the sweetest corn on the market. And they sell the seed for that corn. But you have to sign a contract that you will not sell Murray corn. If you grow it to sell it, you have to have a different contract with them, and that contract says you won't save seeds and you won't sell seeds to anyone else. This is how people who hybrid food are able to get paid for their efforts. And if we said to Monsanto, you know what, you can create all the GMO food you want, but you have to give it all away, we wouldn't get anywhere. Now, an interesting side note to that, Golden Rice, which is a public sector project, farmers not only are allowed to save seeds from golden rice, they're encouraged to. And because it's a genetic modification, unlike a hybrid, which won't necessarily repeat the same plant over and over, genetically modified plants are stable. They're genetically stable, and so they'll reproduce. The progeny will be identical to the parent. And in the public sector projects like the eggplant in Bangladesh and the golden rice in Asia, those seeds are provided to the farmers, and the farmers are allowed to repeat the cycle over and over again. So why isn't BT eggplant available in India? Well, again, it's complicated, and there are a lot of different opinions on that, and because I don't really have the ability or the time to do all of the research on my own, I can only surmise. The arguments kind of go like this. India said, well, we're not sure of the safety of BT eggplant. And Bangladesh said, well, we'll go ahead and plant BT eggplant, and they found out that it works fairly well. Now, they've had some failures with BT eggplant, but they've also had quite a few successes. And India, perhaps, has political reasons for not wanting the impoverished in their communities to do any better than they already are. I don't know that as a fact. I just offer that as a possible conclusion. I know that oftentimes countries will not allow even Red Cross packages to get to the places where they're supposed to go. There's graft and dishonesty in this world all over the place. And that brings me to my final word on the subject. Genetics is powerful. Altering genetics can be permanent. And I imagine we could use this genetic information, knowledge, for evil. But just because it can be used for evil doesn't mean it shouldn't be used for good. In fact, not using it for good things won't prohibit it being used for evil things. Genetically modified food can bring life and quality of life to the corners of the world. Now, it's not the only answer. It's not the solution to world hunger. It's not the end of poverty. But it's one tool in the quiver. Yes, we need to bring water to these impoverished nations, and we need to bring soil structure into a lot of these places. But if you've got a field where you can grow rice, and all you need to do is genetically modify the rice so that that rice has vitamin A, and you can virtually end infant blindness in that part of the world, is it ethical not to? Tuesday night, 7 o'clock Central, I will be on the YouTube live, and my intention, amongst other things, is to discuss genetically modified organisms or any other videos that we've made. This is a good question and answer time, and I hope you take advantage of it. Until then, Emitzer Shem, I'll see you again. I'm Chicken Johnny. Eat your vegetables. Modified or not, eat your vegetables.